For those who value online privacy and personal autonomy, the web is currently in the worst state it has been since its inception. Large platforms like Twitter and Facebook regularly censor content and ban users, and even YouTube has become a hostile space for people pushing the cutting edge of political discourse. In 2018, for example, you had numerous right-wing channels getting hundreds of thousands of views. Stefan Molyneux, who regularly spoke about race realism,
$1. $1.
The Alternative Hypothesis, who did the same, as well as several others like Red Ice TV, used to have channels there. Today, these channels have been banned, and those that haven't been are now severely restricted in terms of reach. This problem isn't just the result of a concerted effort of political actors to go after the online right, but it's also fundamentally a problem with capitalism. Ironically, free speech libertarians have found themselves powerless to prevent censorship from becoming a dominant force in the private space, and this has happened without government intervention. Before the rise of centralized social media platforms, the internet was something of a Wild West full of what we might call small proprietors, independent websites tailor-made for specific content. However, the success of companies like YouTube and the free market has caused a gradual convergence of users onto these controlled platforms. Now, if you want to find content, you'll have to go onto one of these mega sites because corporate-controlled search engines won't even allow you to find those small forums and video sites anymore. Big sites are privileged in terms of search results after all. This means that those big companies practically have control of the internet. They control what you see, what you have access to, and what you can make visible on the internet. In other words, control over public discourse and speech has been accomplished completely privately without any government intervention. The firms that contribute to internet censorship are themselves private. For example, a few years ago, there was a big study tracking what they called quote-unquote hate networks on YouTube that inspired these companies to engage in a mass censorship campaign. That's part of what undid Stefan Molyneux. This censorship apparatus is decentralized and somewhat organic, in the sense that libertarians use that term. Free choice has been applied to restrict choice, and since these companies are technically operating on the basis of their own property and self-ownership, there's really nothing libertarians can condemn them for. Internet censorship is a microcosm of what might actually happen in a free market libertarian society. The most successful companies will have free rein to implement their own ideological agendas, and they will use incentives and disincentives to enforce them. For example, imagine that in Ruritania, Facebook manages to outcompete all other firms in the area, practically attaining a monopoly. To get a job, and thus to eat, you would have to get a job through Facebook. Only a prerequisite for working at a Facebook firm is that you abide by the company's anti-racism policy. If you're a known quote-unquote racist, which is however the company arbitrarily defines it, you simply can't get a job nor gain the capital necessary to start your own business. Again, without even the slightest government intervention, you are being tyrannized, and your individual autonomy has been curtailed. Something else that could also happen is the invention of a social credit system, which would be tied to your actual financial credit. Such a system could be implemented in a completely private manner. Without a centralized government, then digital currencies would become the default medium for transactions, and digital currencies can be designed in such a way as to be capable of tracking everything you do. Imagine that if you bought tobacco, got banned online for racism, or did anything Facebook didn't like, it would lower your credit score. A system of private incentives has been constructed that would effectively fill the hegemonic void that government laws once served, and since it's private, you have no way to push back against them. There's no force you can have implied, such as by, say, a government, to correct the situation and preserve individual autonomy. Social credit can just as easily be constructed by private banks as it can be by, let's say, the Chinese government. What libertarians refuse to acknowledge is that free choice capitalism doesn't pick ideological favorites. Whoever is successful, and they will get to implement whatever ideology they want. In all likelihood, it won't be a conservative ideology, since globalization of profits and production requires as inclusive a social attitude as possible, and companies will want to globalize in order to maximize revenue. The practical manifestation of this problem on the internet is that private companies get bombarded by leftist political groups all the time, and this ends up creating pressure for those companies to comply with leftist ideology. The way internet censorship essentially works, as proven by the experience of Josh Moon from Kiwi Farms, is that they will go after internet service providers and claim that the site violates progressive ideology, which these companies hold. Since these companies are progressive, they will cease serving the sites and cut them off from the internet. In a completely libertarian society, you would get basically the same thing. Leftist mobs terrorizing companies until they cave and start enforcing leftist ideology on a private basis. One problem libertarian members of the alt tech movement have is that they've dedicated themselves to the principle of free speech. But the problem is, free speech does not actually even exist in a libertarian society. Companies are free to enforce speech and to manage their platforms however they want, according to the principles of self-ownership and freedom of association. And by freedom of association, of course, I mean the freedom to associate and dissociate however you want, which implies a right to discriminate. Free speech libertarians end up getting eaten by their own ideology. The practical problem as well is that if you want to serve those who have been censored today, you are going to be serving the radical right, since they're the only people who really get censored these days. Libertarian websites end up having a reputation as right-wing websites, and the libertarians who run them never seem to actually share those views. They think the statist National Socialists are as evil as everyone else thinks they are, so when the leftist mobs come to terrorize their website, usually they cave and end up ironically censoring their content. Most alt-tech websites are like this. There's some exceptions like Rumble or BitChute, but since they have practically become right-wing websites, this ends up pushing normal people away, limiting their market share. All this is exacerbated by switching costs because most people, unless they're very right-wing, are just going to stick to using YouTube or Twitter because it's onerous to visit several different websites for content instead of just one. The libertarian alternative to the status quo, which is usually some form of make-your-own-platform argument, has shown itself to be farcical. It's just not a practical course of action. Ironically, the government has proven itself to be the only thing standing between us and a completely controlled internet. Organizations like ICANN, which assign IPs, have remained largely impartial, and if the task were given to a private company instead, we would expect it to also fall to private political pressure, just as ISPs have done. It's impossible to just make your own ISP or make your own ICANN, since it requires a high degree of institutional organization and the rights to operate on other people's property, such as telecommunications infrastructure. The only solution to this tragedy of the commons is government power, and the only way to ensure that a single ideology dominates in society is to enforce that ideology through government power. The issue is that private solutions will just fall to whoever is the loudest and most violent, and today that would affirmatively be leftists. The other issue with alt tech is essentially a competency crisis. If you're a skilled programmer or IT professional, you're going to work for one of the big companies or a mainstream startup. There's a serious disincentive to working for a controversial alt tech company because it would limit your growth potential and serve as a sort of social branding, making you toxic to the industry. If every competent IT professional has an incentive to work for censorious Google, you're just going to be left with people who are too incompetent to cut it, like Andrew Torba and his friends, who just cut and paste pre-made frameworks together to add quote-unquote new features to Gab. For example, Gab is basically just a fork of Mastodon. The AI that it uses is not homegrown, and the site was so poorly made that it had a number of security flaws, one of which led to the doxing of Stone Toss. Alt tech, due to the incentives inherent to capitalism, simply does not have an incentive to even exist. The only people maintaining it are those who are willing to take one for the team, and those people are very rare. Alt tech will never be very successful, nor profitable, nor will it ever be as functional or as safe as websites like YouTube. When your total consumer base is maybe only 50,000 National Socialists, where are you going to get the money to keep going? When you have trouble keeping payment processors since the so-called free market keeps censoring you, how can you even use that money anyway? The basic fact of the matter is that libertarianism is a fantasy that supposes that the conditions of free market capitalism will continue in perpetuity the relatively free and decentralized conditions of a small proprietor society. As Bertrand de Jouvenel said, however, the fact of expansion will always overrule the Wild West situation, just as the economic development of the real West put the era of freewheeling cowboys to an end. Libertarianism only works when you have a government enforcing it, breaking up companies when they get too large, and putting ideological controls in place to ensure that the good libertarians don't get kicked out of the system. Alt Tech is perhaps the biggest proof that we need a government solution to the problem of online censorship and a solution to the leftist domination of capitalist society.